So far today, we've heard the moral call from Cardinal McCarrick, the stories of refugees and those who welcome them, and now we'll hear from United Nations and U.S. officials about the international and national response to the refugee crisis in the Middle East, which has produced a staggering 4.8 million refugees. Some of the questions we hope to have answered are: will the U.S. meet its announced resettlement goals for Syrians this year and next year? What is the overseas situation currently with regard to the Middle East refugee crisis, and what are the needs that need to be met? What is the U.S. government doing to help integrate refugees from the Middle East into communities across the nation? And lastly, what is the response from the administration to the opposition to resettlement of certain refugees from the Middle East, both on Capitol Hill and in states across the country? Pretty simple, straightforward, non-controversial questions that we hope to have answered today. And we have a distinguished panel to help us do that, who have graciously agreed to speak to us today. And I'll introduce them in the order of them speaking. And I won't go too much into their bios since you have those already. Our first speaker will be Shelly Pitterman. He's the regional representative for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for the U.S. and the Caribbean. Shelly has an illustrious career with the United Nations, having served in several posts in Africa and also in Geneva, where he was the head of the Resettlement section for several years. Our second speaker will be the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Populations, Refugees, and Migration, Simon Henshaw, who is one of the chief architects of the U.S. response to the Syrian crisis and to the humanitarian response to that crisis. Secretary Henshaw has served in several posts overseas in his career as well. And lastly, but not leastly, will be Robert Bob Carey, who is the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the Department of Health and Human Services. And most of you know Bob as well from his time with the International Rescue Committee and also as the chair of Refugee Council USA. So we're happy to have all the distinguished speakers here today. We'll have them speak in order, and then we'll have questions from the floor. So, Shelly, you have the floor.
163,000 Burundian refugees, 987,000 refugees and IDPs fleeing violence in the Central African Republic, and then more than twice as many from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Even more fleeing within and from Somalia and South Sudan. The second largest refugee population is from Afghanistan, a protracted situation for most, but still 380,000 Afghans were newly displaced in 2015. In 2015, 370 refugees and migrants died in the Bay of Bengal. This year so far, 1,360 died or went missing crossing the Mediterranean. 1 million Syrian refugees will have found sanctuary in Europe, and we still don't know how many more will get in during the months to come. UNHCR continues to appeal for more resettlement places and other legal avenues for Syrian refugees. And meanwhile, there are 4.8 million in the host countries neighboring Syria. The unprecedented scope and magnitude of forced displacement has been coined a global refugee crisis. This is a call to find political solutions, first and foremost to end war, and also to meet the needs of the victims of conflict, discrimination, and persecution, and to engage global responsibility, states and other stakeholders, individuals, civil society, and the private sector. Millions and global. Those are big ideas, but the first thing to remember is that we are talking, in the case of each parent and their children, about victims. It may seem self-evident to us here today, evidenced by the stories of people that we know, that we've worked with and served. But now we're also reading and watching about these individuals in the media, since the global refugee crisis has also become a compelling subject for traditional and social media. Public opinion has become rather polarized, with fear underpinning a disturbing anti-refugee populist sentiment that politicians in several countries have massaged and manipulated. Reasonable concerns about national security and the changing environment have had an impact on refugee policies and procedures. But the stirring of xenophobic fear about national identity has led some to portray refugees as a threat, when surely they are the actual victims. Meanwhile, empathy and a sense of responsibility motivate communities around the world to continue to help refugees, as we heard today. Refugees around the world continue to benefit from generous policies of asylum, coupled with access to services and opportunities for self-sufficiency. Refugee resettlement brings out the best in local communities who work in partnership with professional agencies and government to receive refugees and help take care of their families and contribute to the community. This last year revealed that no one country can provide solutions, but each one has a responsibility. And in the absence of collective responsibility, the crisis will deepen. It is revealed that all countries of asylum need the support of their regional neighbors and the international community for asylum to be truly a public good. UNHCR has appealed to all states to keep their borders open to people in need of international protection, to provide access to safety through resettlement and other legal pathways, to protect refugees and asylum seekers from refoulement, to offer refugees and the communities where they live economic and educational opportunities and social services, and finally to increase global financial support through multiple channels. This year, even more than last year, we're confronting the most troubled political humanitarian landscape than at any time since World War II. There's a multiplicity of crises that's shaking the international stage simultaneously. The new emergencies are protracted as the violence persists with the proliferation of non-state and de facto state actors, organized criminal elements and traffickers, who are operating in territories where governments are party to conflict or perhaps too weak to exercise even minimal authority. And just to complete the picture, the old situations don't get resolved, or at best very slowly. Violence and persecution persist, political solutions are elusive, wars have bled economies. The unprecedented challenges created by the multiplicity of conflicts in the 21st century so far have provoked reflections on collective responsibility for protection and solutions. The governing imperatives of asylum, as codified in the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, remain largely intact. Look at Ethiopia, Kenya, notwithstanding the recent announcements, Uganda, Tanzania, Cameroon, Mali, Niger, Tunisia, Malaysia, I could go on. The list goes on of states which have allowed thousands, hundreds of thousands of refugees to seek sanctuary. The numbers of people seeking asylum in Europe and the United States has grown as well. Countries hosting Syrian refugees in the Middle East have demonstrated remarkable generosity. They've spent millions to provide services and safety. Turkey hosts the largest numbers of refugees in the world. And Lebanon has the highest per capita ratio of refugees in the world. Syria and Iraq have among the largest numbers of internally displaced in the world. The majority of Syrian refugees are not in camps, as we know. They're living with families, renting, and yes, many are living in terrible substandard conditions as well. The host governments have received refugees in national schools and health centers. Some refugees now have the right to work. The governments are collaborating well with international agencies and NGOs, and national NGOs are playing an instrumental role in service delivery. Around the world, with each passing day, the humanitarian needs grow. The funding appeals of the UN have reached unprecedented levels. There's more money being committed, and the U.S. remains the most generous of donors, but the amounts secured are simply not enough to keep up. There's some diversification of the donor base and growth in private sector engagement, and that's beginning to make a difference in some sectors and specific operations. UNHCR and its partners are reaching more people and providing more assistance in more innovative ways using modern technology, but still more refugees and displaced are being left behind. the resources the refugees bring with them, after all, many had businesses, professions, property, are being depleted. There's now more evidence of poverty among Syrian refugees and the increased vulnerability that triggered secondary migrations toward Europe in particular, one that is fraught with unknowns and the dangers of unsafe travel and smuggling. Available funding levels permit us to provide minimum relief, but while this heals in the short term, the pressures on host communities and our national budgets continues to rise as long as the triggers for displacement persist. There's a growing realization that the situation cannot be fixed or perhaps even contained just by traditional humanitarian responses. The emergency response has to happen, of course, when thousands of people cross a border to seek some security from war, but the Syria-Iraq mega-crisis and other protracted emergencies in South Sudan, Carey, Yemen, Libya, Myanmar oblige the international community, such as it is, to adopt a multidimensional response that takes into account still so precarious a situation of the large numbers who were forced to flee in recent years, as well as those who continue to arrive in new waves of displacement. The funding and programmatic gaps that challenge us today and which will only become exacerbated tomorrow can be addressed in part by the infusion of development planning and funding from the very outset of a forced displacement. 65% of the world's refugees live outside of camps, in towns and cities and villages, and this has an economic impact on communities and the state. Stretches the welfare services and infrastructure and introduces new demographic challenges as well as political and security risks, especially for those countries of asylum on the front lines of international collective security. This will require important shifts in the approaches of bilateral development agencies and international financial institutions. There are some promising steps being taken by the World Bank, for example, which need more backing and institutional framing. The governments which have provided such generous humanitarian support over the years, and some which have not, will need to see that it serves the collective good to ensure that those frontline states providing asylum to hundreds of thousands of refugees are offered additional help to sustain, if not grow, their economies and to maintain a peaceful environment for asylum in the face of nearby threats that pose significant risks to regional and international security. 2016 is shaped up to be a year of opportunity. The London conference at the end of January raised an extraordinary $12 billion in pledges to help Syrian refugees, with credible amounts dedicated to education and livelihoods. Multi-year pledges are on the rise. UNHCR appeals for these pledges to be honored soon. A UNHCR conference at the end of March to solicit commitments for resettlement may have yielded modest results in numerical terms, but it was marked by a broader focus on other legal avenues that states can pursue to provide protection, for example, through family reunification, labor migration schemes, student scholarships, and other forms of humanitarian admission. At the spring meeting in April, the World Bank raised $1 billion in grants and concessional loan financing to assist states in the Middle East and North Africa to help refugees and host communities. Next week, the World Humanitarian Summit will convene, and we're all looking forward to renewed commitment in respect of international humanitarian law so that senseless bombings of hospitals and IDP camps cease once and for all, and that humanitarian access to stranded or embattled populations is guaranteed, as well as new commitments for more and better managed financing of humanitarian assistance. The UN General Assembly Summit on 19 September will be focused on large-scale movements of refugees and migrants. And on the 20th, President Obama will convene a summit among countries that have introduced practical measures that promote education and livelihoods, increase multilateral funding, and expand resettlement places. All of this could, in sum, project us into a new period where conflict prevention and resolution, asylum and migration management, humanitarian assistance and development are all more deliberately and conscientiously promoted with a view to providing necessary protection and care to refugees and to finding solutions to their plight. We can only hope so, and it depends very much on you and your support for the work of UNHCR and advocacy with the United States. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Almost afternoon. I'd very much like to thank Kevin and the center, my fellow panelists, and all of you for being here today, hosting this. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me thank Shelly for outlining the dimensions of this displacement crisis, the worst we've seen since World War II. I do want to open by making it clear that this crisis is so serious and so bad, not just because of the Middle East, but because of a series of crises around the world, many of which originate in Africa. But today we're here to talk about the Middle East, so I will center my remarks there. The global repercussions of the Syrian crisis and the conflicts that fuel it seem to widen and deepen. The United States will not relent in pushing for a nationwide ceasefire across Syria, humanitarian access for all those in need, and a political settlement that can finally put an end to this catastrophic war. In the 5 years that it has raged, it's killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians, displaced half the population, and driven nearly 5 million men, women, and children into exile. But its effects have been felt far beyond Syria's borders. Lebanon is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, one already roiled by political, demographic, and sectarian pressures, and with a fragile economy. But 1 in 5 people today living in Lebanon is a refugee from Syria, 1 in 5. In Jordan, nearly 80,000 Syrian refugees live in just one camp called Zatri. But the vast majority of refugees in Jordan, more than 80% of them, live outside camps in poor neighborhoods where water is scarce, social services are limited, hospitals are overcrowded, and schools do not have enough classrooms. Turkey now hosts 3 million refugees and more Syrians than any other country, more Syrian refugees than any other country. The government of Turkey reports that it has spent billions of dollars providing shelter, healthcare, and other services. But life for refugees is hard, in part because most of them do not speak Turkish. For many Syrian refugees, years of exile and frustration have whittled life down to a daily struggle for survival. Their savings are exhausted, and many in cities and towns are falling deeper and deeper into poverty. Fighting in Iraq continues to terrorize and scatter civilians as well. Since January 2014, nearly 3.5 million people have been displaced, many by Daesh rampage across a third of the country. Its cruel fanaticism and its quest to enslave, kill, and to erase history. Nearly a third of Iraq's population urgently needs humanitarian assistance, including an estimated 3 million living in territories still held by Daesh, that aid agencies are rarely able to reach to provide protection and life-providing aid. Our government is committed to aiding the millions of people swept up in these crises. Our nation has provided more humanitarian aid in response to the Syrian crisis than any other nation. Total U.S. contributions now stand at $5.1 billion. Last month, Secretary of State Carey announced nearly $155 million in additional humanitarian assistance to displaced and vulnerable Iraqis, bringing the U.S. contribution to $778 million since the beginning of fiscal year 2014. The State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration provides most of this assistance by funding the work of international organizations. These include the UN Refugee Agency, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the Palestinian Refugee Agency, the International Organization for Migration, the UN Children's Fund, and others. We also support non-governmental organizations that work in this field. Along with our partners, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which also funds the World Food Program and other organizations that respond to emergencies. These operations deliver essential life-saving assistance: food, shelter, medical care, clean water, sanitation. They protect the rights of the displaced, care for survivors of sexual violence, reunify families, educate children and youth, and help people gain the skills they need to be self-sufficient. U.S. humanitarian leadership and diplomacy are indispensable. In crisis after crisis, it has helped countries keep borders open and aid flowing. This has saved millions of lives. Most displaced people who flee across borders stay in neighboring countries and hope to one day return home. The vast majority of Syrian refugees, more than 4.8 million Syrian men, women, and children, remain in the region. But like people anywhere, refugees need more than food and shelter. They need a chance to live in dignity, and they need a reason to live, to hope. Last year, more than 1 million men, women, and children crossed into Europe from the Middle East and North Africa, and more than 4,000 lost their lives when their flimsy boats capsized or sank. We believe empowering refugees to be productive and self-sufficient, to build a future where they are, can discourage dangerous sea voyages. We encourage host countries to allow adults to work and children to attend school, and are pleased that Syria's neighbors are moving to offer more legal work permits and enroll more Syrian children in public school. This coming fall in Jordan, we expect almost every Syrian child to be in school. A very large step forward. Secretary Carey and other diplomats are working around the world and around the clock to stop violent conflicts, put an end to persecution, and make it safe for refugees to return home. But today, conflicts often drag on for years. While we continue to work to end conflicts so that refugees can return home, and continue to work to improve the conditions for refugees in countries of first asylum, for some refugees, especially the most vulnerable, resettlement to a third country may be the best option. While less than 1% of all refugees worldwide are resettled, the need for resettlement opportunities has never been greater. Displacement has reached record levels, and the number of refugees able to safely return home has dropped to a 30-year low. The United Nations has estimated that close to 500,000 Syrians need new permanent homes away from the region. As you know, the United States resettles more refugees than any other nation. Since 1975, Americans have welcomed over 3.2 million from all over the world. The refugees we resettle are the ones most in need of a safe home. They may belong to persecuted religious or ethnic minorities. They may be victims of torture, survivors of atrocities, women at risk, or children with severe medical conditions that urgently need treatment. They may be activists or journalists who jeopardize their lives by championing human rights or simply telling the truth. In response to the UN's call for more resettlement, we are expanding our program, increasing the numbers we will admit from roughly 70,000 in each of the past 3 fiscal years to 85,000 this fiscal year. And of this total of 85,000, we aim to admit at least 10,000 refugees from Syria. Gearing up to do this has required an enormous effort and has been logistically challenging. We are committed to reaching President Obama's 2016 targets and have been working with our partners to build the capacity required, adding human and other resources. The Departments of State and Homeland Security work together to send additional staff to Jordan. And between February and April, the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service interviewed almost 12,000 applicants who had been referred by UNHCR for refugee resettlement in the United States. We also restarted DHS refugee resettlement interviews in Beirut in February, and we expect to continue conducting these interviews regularly. Late last year, we began processing refugee resettlement cases in Erbil, Iraq, and this will continue as well. We expect Syrian refugee arrivals to the U.S. to accelerate steadily throughout this fiscal year. Expediting admissions does not mean cutting corners or curtailing the robust security screening process. All of our applicants for resettlement remain subject to the same stringent security requirements. Refugees are the most thoroughly screened category of traveler to the United States, and Syrian refugees are subject to even more screening. These checks involve multiple U.S. agencies. The U.S. government is determined both to safeguard the American public and to offer refuge to some of the world's most vulnerable people. We do not believe that these goals are mutually exclusive. As President Obama has said, slamming the door in the face of refugees would betray our deepest values. The U.S. refugee admissions program has always relied on strong local support, and we are confident that American communities will continue to open their doors and hearts as they have done for generations. In the past, however much politicians argued over other matters, they agreed that we have a fundamental moral duty to protect innocent civilians scattered by crisis. Our refugee admissions program has been a source of pride, not acrimony. I know many of you share our dismay at the inflammatory rhetoric about refugees and migrants that is threatening to drown out rational discourse and erode cherished ideals. Behind the policy debates and statistics are real individuals with stories, dreams, and lives that were shattered through no fault of their own. And like those who have come before them, they will bring energy, dynamism, a desire to work hard, and deep appreciation for the blessings of safety and freedom our country offers. Refugees reinvent themselves here, determined to seize opportunities and make a better life for their children. They start businesses, revitalize communities, they make our culture more vibrant and our nation stronger. So let me thank all of you who have championed compassion over fear, and remind all of us of our fundamental duty to help others in their hour of need. And along with you, I look forward to hearing more from Bob Carey about steps that the U.S. government is taking to help communities across the country welcome and integrate refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Don, Kevin, and Shelly. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to excuse I transitioned from a cold courtesy of one of my children to the seasonal allergies in Washington, so if I'm not clear, I'll blame my children. But thank you. It's very much an honor to be here, and I know that many of you already play a critical role in welcoming refugees to communities across the United States, and for that, both ORR and I personally are deeply appreciative. Today I would like to provide you with an overview of the work of the Office of Refugee Resettlement and its services, highlighting efforts that the office is working on to strengthen integration outcomes and promoting welcoming communities, as well as briefly discuss the ORR budget. In keeping with the focus of today's agenda, I'd like to, at the outset, state that we are very much remain committed to the administration's efforts to resettle 10,000 Syrian refugees in the United States this year. Service to the most vulnerable is at the heart of the mission of the United States Refugee Resettlement Program, and our success as a nation of immigrants is rooted in the American values of equality and opportunity. And this is reflected in our commitment to welcome and integrate newcomers into the fabric of our nation. I believe that these efforts benefit not only immigrants and their families, but also strengthen our communities and our nation as a whole. And this is demonstrated every day in communities across the country. The Office of Refugee Resettlement within the Administration for Children and Families was established by the Refugee Act of 1980 to help refugees integrate into their new communities and become self-sufficient. ORR carries out this mission through an extensive public-private partnership network, many of which you participate in, and funding to state governments and nonprofit organizations across the country. Over 3 million refugees from more than 70 countries, the majority of whom are women and children, have been provided safe haven in the U.S. since the passage of the Refugee Act of 1980. People fleeing persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion come to the United States seeking a new beginning and freedom from persecution and displacement. From the date of their arrival, the Office of Refugee Resettlement provides time-limited cash and medical assistance to newly arrived refugees, as well as case management services, English language instruction, and employment services, all of which are designed to facilitate refugees' successful transition and integration into life in the United States. In addition to serving refugees, ORR's mission has steadily expanded over the last 35 years to include asylees, foreign-born victims of human trafficking, Cuban and Haitian entrants, Iraqi and Afghan special immigrant visa holders, survivors of tortures, and unaccompanied children. As reflected in our country's commitment to welcome and integrate refugees, we believe refugees should be able to participate in all aspects of American life, including involvement with their children's schools, parent-teacher associations, that they're able to read and speak English well enough to navigate civil society and to shop at a grocery store and complete a job application. In order to effectively integrate refugees, it is important that refugee serving organizations partner with other civil society actors on the local level, such as vocational and literacy agencies, employment entities, and other mainstream service providers. Receiving communities play a critical role in our efforts to resettle refugees. As we have seen, it is important to engage receiving communities and effectively communicate both the needs and the assets that refugees bring to our communities. With this outreach, we can foster a welcoming environment. Successful resettlement is a two-way interaction between both refugees and receiving communities in workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, places of worship, and other community institutions. To this end, ORR supports a wide range of programs that foster employment, economic development, and integration. Some examples of this include our micro enterprise development program, which is assisting refugees to start businesses, and the individual development accounts program, under which matched savings accounts are in place to help refugees achieve financial goals related to economic advancement, such as purchasing a car or a home. We have a refugee child care provider which provides business opportunities. These are all through NGO partners to refugee women where they're in markets where there's a shortage of child care opportunities. Through this grant, refugees, women and men, receive both training and establish agreements or contracts with state or county child care offices so they may qualify for state county child care reimbursement as service providers and become successful independent entrepreneurs. We have a matching grants program under which privately raised funds through community organizations, resettlement organizations across the country provide an alternative to public cash assistance, under which ORR service eligible populations are supported as they become self-sufficient within 120 to 180 days of program eligibility, which is an extraordinary standard, and under which close to 80% of the program participants are self-sufficient at the end of the program. So it's an extraordinary achievement. and under which privately raised funds are matched by government funds. So it very much exemplifies the core tenets of the U.S. program, which is both early self-sufficiency and public-private partnership. We also have an ethnic community self-help program, which provides ethnic community-based organizations with resources to provide services to their own community members and others to assist them in becoming integrated into American society. But primarily in the areas of cultural adjustment and integration, and which are critical. In addition to the services I previously highlighted, OR has a number of technical assistance providers. So we seek to leverage the resources across the country by providing technical assistance to ensure that curriculums don't have to be redeveloped, and that we can assist in the transfer of best practices across the country. Prominent among those technical assistance providers and present here today is Welcoming America, which works to create welcoming communities. They do this by providing tools that assist in civic engagement to support and sustain resettlement work, build partnerships, address the challenging environment which sometimes exists relative to resettlement in communities currently, build new partnerships, and essentially ensure that we never want to lose sight of their unique gifts and talents. Their identities and experiences make our communities better. Through our work, we know that there are a number of indicators that demonstrate integration, including health and well-being, language acquisition, economic advancement, civic engagement, and educational achievement, as well as housing and social connections. We work to advance and outcomes in all of these areas. Finally, our budget, which I know is of interest to many and certainly of critical importance. The fiscal year 2016 enacted budget level for all OR programs, which includes our services to unaccompanied children, which OR also administers, is established at $1.6 billion approximately. This does represent an increase from fiscal year 2015. OR will serve approximately 85,000 refugees as our target for fiscal year 2016, in addition to other eligible populations, for a total projected 192,000 humanitarian migrants. OR provides funding to states on a quarterly basis, and to date we have provided funding for the first 2 quarters, so we're well on track. For fiscal year 2017, the President's budget request includes $2.2 billion for OR programs and represents the costs of providing services for additional refugees and other entrants and unaccompanied children, and for expanded assistance to domestic victims of trafficking. The budget request for 2017 would support a total of 213,000 humanitarian arrivals, and of whom 100,000 would be refugees, consistent with the administration's commitment to admit this number. OR also has a number of discretionary programs to support states and service providers meet the needs of incoming refugees. Among those are ethnic community organizations I referenced, preferred communities, targeted assistance to communities which have received significant numbers of refugees, as well as mentoring and after-school services to support youth through our school impact programs. In conclusion, I'd like to thank you for what you do every day across the country. Refugee resettlement, I believe, is a reflection of our core values as a country, and providing protection to individuals fleeing persecution is an element in that. We appreciate your continued partnership in this critical area. Thank you.
Issues. That means increasing the amount of money the traditional donors are giving. That means finding new donors, which means both new countries and looking beyond countries, private enterprise. We've got some new ideas out of the World Bank on using low loans, using development money to help communities that host refugees. So a widening of funds and expansion of funds to help refugees and the communities in which they're living. We want to see a greater resettlement. We would like to see some changes in the way that donors and the United Nations interact with one another. We're pushing for more transparency on their side, and they're pushing for us to do more with less earmarking of money and using less one-year money, but using multiple-year money instead. So these are some of the broad goals we're looking for. And all on top of this, resettlement. In resettlement countries, encouraging countries to change policies so that they're more friendly towards refugees, particularly in offering more employment opportunities and offering education for children. So that's really the package, and then they're being done and handled in different ways in different conferences. There are other issues that will come up in some of the conferences, such as migrants, how better to give migrants protection and what more we do for them. And I'm sure there's some others that I'm forgetting. Now, for the two conferences at UNGA, the 19th and the 20th, the first one is the UN conference. That's a wider span, so it's looking at a number of refugee issues. The second one on the 20th, which is the President Obama Summit, it's really three issues, all of which I've mentioned in my list before, but that's increased donations, more resettlement, and increased opportunities for refugees in the countries in which they first fled.
No, the only thing I would add is just the reference document for the UNGA meeting on the 19th of September. It's a public document, and it's quite rich in detail. It was crafted by Carey and Beth Ferris and other folks that you perhaps know of from refugee work. It's called In Safety and Dignity, Addressing Large Movements of Refugees and Migrants. And it's a document that's addressed to the General Assembly in the first person by the Secretary General, calling for certain commitments in relation to the global response to refugee and migration and vulnerable migrant movements. And so UNHCR is quite satisfied with the chapters that relate to refugees. So I don't have a number for the document, but it's a General Assembly document, and I presume that it's readily available.
Okay, we'll go to our questions, Bill.
Bill Canny, MRS. We've been having some debates on the OR budget, contentious at times. Since you have been polled, you vote for children, you're not asking questions. Shelly, this is probably for you. Didn't hear too much. Shelly, what were the combination of factors? Certainly the war, the continued pushing of Syrians out, and Iraqis, already in this country. But what were the combination of factors that led to the march on Europe? And if you could, how did the chaos in Libya, the continued chaos, play a part in that? Has UNHCR done a bit of analysis on what happened, and can you share that?
When the former High Commissioner Guterres spoke, I think, very eloquently to the push and pull factors in relation to the mass movement through Greece in particular. But there was a preceding movement through Libya, Egypt, Libya, of Syrian refugees, but it was more combined with North African migrants as well, from going to Malta and to Italy. The factors that we understand created the move were despair, first of all. People were, that was in the fourth year of the conflict, although we had already signaled concern to Europe when the first 12,000 irregular, boat people, if you will, started to cross at the end of 2012. And the numbers continued to rise subsequently. But it was a combined effect of despair, hope as well for their children's education, They were finding that refugees had less access to school now that problem, so to speak, is being more seriously addressed in Lebanon and Jordan. But there was a definite problem in terms of access to services, and in particular education. The third trigger, if you will, was because of funding shortages. In 2014, WFP stopped or cut significantly its food rations to refugees. And that was sort of the tipping point, if you will, that generated quite considerable movements. And it was then as well that Angela Merkel and Sweden and Austria and to a large extent popular opinion in those countries had a welcoming attitude that was to some extent a bit of a pull, one might say, but the real push factors were despair, hope for education, and constrained access to services while in asylum, and then lastly the cutting of food.
So Casey Thomas from Soccer Without Borders again. We actually are partners with a couple other organizations in Baltimore and receive funding through the Refugee School Impact Grant that you mentioned. I wanted to bring up the idea, and I think it was shared in the first panel, that especially with the language barrier, services in the first few months obviously are very important and very life-saving in a lot of cases for refugees, but you mentioned mentoring and after-school programming, and that's the sort of thing that we do at Soccer Without Borders, and that kind of programming can't be, temporary or, just for the first few months. So I guess my question, and this could be for anyone, but particularly Bob, what role do you see government having in terms of funding support services, especially for youth over a longer term?
Within ORR, we have identified services to youth and children as a priority, and that's reflected in the President's 2017 budget request. So certainly, we see that is a long-term ongoing effort, some of which ORR services are time limited, but they extend up to 5 years after arrival. So we see the continuum of services as being, subject to the availability of funds and ongoing. So we can't tell you which, we support the President's budget, we hope others do, and that it will be fully funded.
Sorry. Hannah Postel from the Center for Global Development. We're doing a lot of work sort of trying to innovate around the idea that there's like the short-term budget for a lot of the tensions that we're facing are really in the short term in terms of time and effort and money, et cetera. But refugees are largely accepted to make medium to long-term economic and other contributions to their host societies. And so we were just sort of wondering what sorts of innovations or incentives you thought might be useful for countries to sort of recognize this medium to long-term trade-off and alleviate that short-term problem.
With all due respect, I'm not sure I agree it's a short-term problem. I think we have a long-term problem. But to encourage other countries to resettle more. I'm not sure I'm answering your question here, but what I'll say is that we have an advantage in that we're a country of immigrants. We are bringing in, I believe, over 600,000 legal immigrants every year. This doesn't count people that come undocumented, which is another number. It doesn't count students, which I think is at 900,000 this year. Those of you interested, 300,000 of those are Chinese students. It's kind of an interesting statistic. So we're a country that not only is bringing in a lot of people, but has a history of bringing in a lot of people. So we're good at bringing in people that are different and integrating them. It always reminds me of a Conehead joke where someone looks strangely at the Saturday Night Live Conehead, some American suburbanite, says, "You're not around here from here, are you?" And these funny-looking people with cones on their heads say, "No, we're from France." And they go, "Oh, of course, yeah." it's kind of the American attitude to somebody new. You're a little different. Where you're from? Well, we don't care. Well, other countries have a much harder time at this, and I think that's the big barrier is working with other countries which aren't used to bringing in different cultures and different people, and how you get over that, I'm not completely sure. We spend a lot of time sharing our system and our efforts and working with countries. We just work with the British a lot on their new program, but it only has so much effect in certain countries. I'm sorry if I'm not answering your question.
Okay, next question.
Chris, again, this is more focused on issues related to policy. Next month, Britain will go and vote on the decision state in the EU. One of the drivers for this debate on immigration is the refugee crisis. Some commentators have speculated that if they decide to leave the EU, that might undermine continued support for the Schengen zone and also resettlement of refugees. What do you anticipate will happen if they decide to leave the EU? What will we see the United States and the UNHCR in sort of reinforcing that resolve in the case of Brexit?
Let me start by just saying the United States believes it's important for Britain to remain in the European Union. The European Union is a great success, both economically and diplomatically. It's brought peace to Europe, and it's a centerstone of U.S. European foreign policy, and we believe that Britain's membership in it is of primary importance. However, on the question, let me remind you that Britain isn't actually in the Schengen zone, so I'm not sure what the immediate effects on internal migration will be, because Britain is already both given geography, water, and now being in the Schengen zone has sort of cut itself off somewhat. And where I would see the problem would be on the assistance side. Britain gives the second largest amount of money separately to humanitarian refugee issues, but it is a big player within the EU, making the EU jointly the second largest contributor. If you count countries, Britain is, and count institutions, the European Union is. So I wouldn't be worried about continued European commitment to supporting refugee assistance overseas without the British involvement, because they are very, very committed to that. They're a big player.
I would only add that last year the UNHCR was quite consistent with respect to the need for Europe to get together and come up with a common position, which it did, which it did not implement. And now we are where we are with a new agreement between the EU and Turkey, which is for now not yet being fully implemented, and we will have to just see how it evolves. And in the meantime, we have stranded populations in Greece and hidden populations making their way through the Balkans as well as other trajectories to find security, to reunite with families who've arrived already in Germany and elsewhere. So it's very important for UNHCR that European states keep their borders open, although many of them have been closed, but to provide necessary safeguards for protection, to ensure that refugees who are returned to another location are protected from being sent back to unsafe situations. But it's a very unsettling situation now in Europe for UNHCR's protection role, and we're working tirelessly to ensure that the outcomes of these discussions at the European Council level are as good as possible to deal for refugees, given the positions of certain states which have not been very supportive.
My name is Benny. I have a question for Africa. Right now, the Kenyan government is threatening to close the refugee camps. And I just wonder, because we are talking about Middle East and Europe, but let me ask this question as an African. What the international coalition is doing to stop Kenya to not close the refugee camp, because we have thousands of refugees, Somalia, Eritrea, and all over, they are those refugee camps. And as a former refugee resettler from Kenya, I have a concern. What can we do from the US perspective to stop Kenya not to close those refugee camps? Thank you.
Let me just say, generally, as I said at the top of my remarks, Africa plays a major role in today's refugee and migrant crisis. And over half of our resources are aimed at supporting refugees within Africa. I know today we're talking about the Middle East, but a huge amount of what my bureau does, and what Shelly's organization does, and other humanitarian organizations is work in Africa. On our resettlement side, I don't have the percentages in my head, but a very large amount of the people who resettle in the United States are from Africa. Our biggest growing program right now, other than Syria, is for Congolese. And Congolese will be a very large number of those that we resettle in the coming years. On parity with Syrians, maybe a little bit more. Kenya has played secondly, let me say that Kenya has played a historic role as being the refuge for many peoples fleeing war in the region. It has certain security concerns, which we recognize, but we don't want it to give up its role of being a place of refuge. We are more than concerned, very concerned with their statements that they plan to close Dadaab, and we're engaging in conversations with them right now, as are others. It's not quite clear how it's going to play out, but we think that it's very important that they continue their current role. We're also talking to them about continuing resettlement programs, because we resettle out of Canada, and it's important to us that those programs remain active.
I have nothing more to add. It's sort of like a work in progress. There's a lot of engagement with the Kenyan authorities. The High Commissioner will be going to Kenya, certainly the United States and other partners from the international community to try to understand the motivations and to try to address them again, because this isn't the first time that Kenya has raised concerns about the security in Dadaab, which is the second largest city, the largest refugee camp in the world. So hopefully there will be a resolution that will ensure that refugees are not pushed back to Somalia prematurely, that they're enabled to have a choice to go back to locations in Somalia that are safe and secure and they can return home.
Any more questions from the floor? I had a couple of fun parting questions. Depends on, it's in the eye of the beholder, I guess. But first thing I want to say is we were very heartened, I think, as a refugee community with the administration's response to many of the states who declared that they did not want to resettle Syrian refugees or other Middle Eastern refugees after the Paris attacks. So we thank you for that and for the President's comments. So having said that, I want to ask two follow-up questions. First of all, where we are in terms of the resettlement of Syrians this year, the 10,000 goal, with the fiscal year being a few months away. And secondly, there have been a few states recently that pulled out of the refugee program. Could you clarify what exactly that means and what the administration response to those states has been, if you can share that with us?
We are bring in 10,000 Syrian refugees this year. As I mentioned, we interviewed over 12,000 just in the past few months. We've already brought in 2,000, so we have enough in the pipeline to bring them in. It would be an accelerated number, but one that we can handle in the next few months. I see a little criticism in the press. I never said I was going to bring in 10,000 divided by 12 each month. Always makes me think, like, if I invited 10 people to dinner and said dinner will be ready in 2 hours, will 5 of them show up after an hour and demand that dinner is ready because I'm halfway there? It's a process, and we have to move people through this process, but they are moving through at an appropriate rate for us to meet our goal. And it's our every intention to get there. It's not been easy. We've had to put a huge amount of resources into doing this. We haven't changed our security procedures, so that they're lengthy, but we were on track. And I've talked so long about that, I've forgotten what your second question was.
It's about the states.
Oh, that's Bob, yeah.
Clearly Kevin and I have a different definition of fun. But as I referenced when I spoke earlier, the U.S. program is very much a public-private partnership, and so resettlement takes place with a variety of actors across the country. And in a number of states, there currently is a privately administered program where the state has elected, for a variety of reasons, not to administer refugee resettlement in that state. So in the states which it is a federal program, refugees are resettled across the country, and that decision is made as part of the consultation process that takes place nationally. So if a state elects not to participate in the refugee resettlement program, there is a mechanism, it's called the Wilson-Fish program model, which is legislatively authorized, under which a private designee will be determined to be the administrator for the program. And programs for states which choose to pull out, that is the model, is that essentially the private designee acts in the stead of the state to carry out the same funded programs that would otherwise be. So it's a seamless transition, and it's a program that will continue as it would in another state that resettles refugees. Yes.
Okay, let's thank our speakers for coming. Before you run off, I'm going to ask Don to come up and give a quick wrap-up. And Cardinal McCarrick's speech is on the table back there, and we're going to post speeches as they're made available. So look at our website. Thank you.
It will be quick, I promise. I know that I'm between you all and lunch. So let me just say, but it'll be so energizing that you won't even be hungry, okay? So what we tried to do today is to kind of lift up the importance of a defining program for the United States so that we might build more support for greater refugee protection and more resettlement in the United States. And I want to say defining in a lot of ways, defining in terms of its U.S. heritage, in terms of its identity, its values, and the great, diverse, striving people that it's brought to the United States, and millions of them, 3.2 million since 1975. That's a really remarkable statistic we should all be proud of. U.S. leadership for the resettlement program has been essential to responding to past refugee crises. It's going to be essential to responding to this crisis as well. And it's tied, I have to say, to its leadership in terms of a generous resettlement program, in terms of its peacemaking, and in terms of its contributions to host communities. So that there's more than resettlement, but resettlement is a very important piece of it. We all know about the opposition to certain refugees that we've heard in presidential debates, from governors, from Congress. However, here's the other side of the story, and I'm sorry that there's not more press here. I hope there was some press here today. Great. Because I think that this is a story that's not told yet, and it needs to be told, and that is the vast amount of interest that the resettlement agencies are hearing from private people who now understand and get refugee resettlement in a way that they haven't in a number of years. The goodwill to Middle Eastern refugees and to other refugees, Melanie and Bill and others discussed that. I think that's something that needs to be lifted up and maybe would be an antidote to some of the hostility that we've been seeing. People offering to take families in, to contribute, to advocate, to give, and they are giving through programs like the Power Program and many other initiatives that we featured today. Let me say that an underlying issue here, one of the barriers to a strong program that we talked about is the national security fears. And those concerns, I would say, are taken so seriously that, as Melanie put it, the refugee resettlement program is no longer a relief or a rescue program. And I think that actually we shouldn't be so proud that it takes 2 years to screen refugees. I think that it should take, you can secure these flows just as easily in a shorter period of time. It used to be that we all said that we were creating insecurity by keeping people in these places for 2 years. It should be less, and it should be just as secure. What's the possible connection or nexus between refugees and migrants? Well, here's what we know empirically. That state violence and terrorism in states is correlated with high rates of terrorism, of course, and that terrorism leads to displacement. In other words, refugees are victims of terrorism, as Shelly said and pointed out. That's the most empirically grounded link that we know between terrorists and refugees, and it was the experience of our 2 speakers today from Syria and Iraq. The rejecting Muslims and anybody in need is not American, and I think that theme came out very clearly, and we can only keep repeating it because it's so important. It's not part of any of our religious traditions, not part of any of them. The antidote, I think it's true, Father said this on the second panel, to suspicion and hostility to refugees is actually to get to know them. And those kinds of initiatives that allow that are very, very important and need to be lifted up. Our VOLAG panel discussed tactical challenges to resettlement, how to leverage support for Syrian refugees, for support for refugees from other places based on need. That's really when you have a sympathetic population, to use that to leverage and broaden support for others is, I think, crucially important, and that's a strategic challenge for the community. How to increase private engagement in resettlement was a major theme. How to track and support persons beyond the period of federally funded resettlement is extremely important. It's an issue that Joe Cudahy raised and that Bill responded to, and others. And then the final panel, well, they're fresh in your mind, so I'm not going to go over what they've just said, but let me just make a few points and a few takeaways from it. And I thought that they were terrific. In response, in the absence of a collective response, Shelly said, individual state responses will fail. And I think that that's exactly right. I mean, the size of these multiple crises, these enduring crises, these new crises that occur every year. And one of the statistics that I've heard is that over the last year alone, there's been 15 reignited crises, refugee-producing crises in the world alone, which is depressing, disheartening, but it calls for a global response. It really does. And what does that response look like? It looks like major diplomacy. It looks like peacemaking. It looks like large increases in funding for host communities and UN agencies. It looks like diversification of the funding base, greater private sector responses, and greater refugee resettlement and legal migration options. Simon went through all of that. And we're very happy to hear that all 10,000 Syrians will be eating in the United States, will be going to dinner here in the United States this year. I think that's great to hear, and in your house, that's great. we look forward to coming by. And then kind of a strong theme, the need for resettlement of vulnerable refugees has really never been greater. It's maybe 1% of the people that really need to be resettled. But the point is that that's a crucial 1%. It's a very vulnerable 1%, and that program really has to be lifted up like we tried to do today. I wanted to thank Bob, too, for reminding us of ORR's extensive services to so many vulnerable populations, refugees and more, and his vision of full participation of these populations in our society, which ORR handles on a relatively modest budget, and it needs more support. So thank you to our public officials, our panels, our public leaders, and for all of your participation and commitment to these issues.